Today we'll be discussing the status of civic space in Rivers State. Before we jump in, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. We've all been using Zoom a lot over these last few months or years now. But just a brief overview here. If you do have any questions or comments, please make use of the chat function. We will reference these during the discussion later, and I may come to you to give you a chance to ask in person if you prefer. Please also keep all your webcams off throughout the discussion. This is to help us with bandwidth. Some people may be struggling more than others, and this makes a difference. Please also mute your mics as well, so we don't have any interference throughout the discussion. And if you have any difficulties with access, send a direct message to Daniel in the chat box and he'll help you out. So I also want to note that this panel is being recorded so that we can make it available on our YouTube channel afterwards. And we'll send a link to all of those who took part afterwards. So now that's out the way, I'll give you an overview of what we're here to talk about today. So first, I'll give you an introduction to SDN and the topic at hand, and then step back for our panelists to come in and give a 5-minute introduction to the topic where they'll outline their views. We'll then open the floor for discussion. Panelists can interact with each other, and some of the questions from the public will be posed to the panelists. And then we'll come back at the end to sum up the discussion and explain where you can access the full report and webinar recording. So, introduction. So, SDN, or Stakeholder Democracy Network, we're a civil society organization with 15 years experience in the Niger Delta. We support those affected by the extractive sector and weak governance. And I'd like to thank the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office for their support of this work and the wider project. And it's important to note that the information here does not represent their views or policies. So why are we here? Well, we're here to discuss the civic space. And for those of us who are not aware, civic space is essentially the platform that enables us to share ideas, stay informed, and actively participate in defining decisions in society without harassment. Now in Nigeria, the civic space has become increasingly under threat in recent years, especially from state actors. The focus has been at the national level, rather understandably, but I'm excited to introduce this panel discussion, which will look at the civic space at the subnational level, specifically Rivers State and the wider Niger Delta, and why this is so important to consider. So my name is Alexander Siwa. I'm a Senior Research and Policy Officer at SDN, and I'll be joined by an illustrious panel who are very active in civic space in Rivers State and Nigeria writ large. First, we have Flora Asieri, who's the Senior Project Officer at SDN. Flora, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Next, we have Inibehe Effiong. He's the Principal Counsel at Inibehe Effiong Chambers. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to have you here. And next, we have Enafa George Will, who is the chairman of Rivers State Civil Society Organizations. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you for the time. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, sir. And then last, but by no means least, we have Chioma Ezenwafo, who's a broadcast journalist appearing on Nigeria Info 92.3 FM. You're welcome, Chioma.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. Okay, so now without further ado, let's turn to our first panelist, Flora, over to you for the first 5 minutes to give your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Hello, everyone. I would like to start off by saying that the sociopolitical dynamics associated with the Niger Delta are quite different from those at the national level. And so for civic space and CSOs in the Niger Delta, we have evolved over time and we face different threats. In the analysis so far, civic space in Nigeria is focused on the national and not differences at the national or rather the subnational level. It also follows a trajectory of being either open or closed. In 2020, SDN conducted a research on key civic space challenges in Rivers State. What we did was to utilize the Oxfam approach, which is via the civic space monitoring tool. It recognizes that civic space is multidimensional and that it is constantly shifting. So while progress can be made in some areas, there are other areas that might be going downhill. So for SDN, this approach enabled us to identify areas of threat, which propels other civil society organizations to start working to protect and enhance the civic space in Rivers State. Now, what are some of our key findings? It reveals that the civic space in Rivers State is squeezed across all dimensions, and that it is even on a negative trend to further closure. Our findings also revealed that civil society actors, in particular state actors, are under immense pressure. So what happens in Rivers State is that there's a case where you have state actors who tend to suppress civil society organizations' efforts, to open up civic space in Rivers State. A typical example is the move to ban the EndSARS protest in Port Harcourt. And successfully it was overturned, and CSOs and other citizens in the state came out in their numbers. Another key finding from our research reveals that civil society actors, or rather the most close dimension of civic space, is access to funding, administration and bureaucracy, and safety and well-being. A typical example is a case study which was drawn from our research that talked about a journalist who was picked up and tortured by operatives of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, which is SARS, because of his views on air. Another finding shows that the most closed dimension of civic space is access to funding, administration and bureaucracy, and safety and well-being. Another is that the trend that happens to be positive is in civil society legitimacy and accountability. But I must note on this point that this was actually rated by civil society actors during the course of the research. Now, what are some of the recommendations? The research was conducted with other civil society organizations, and from the discussions and dialogue that ensued, we came up with a couple of recommendations that we are proposing to the public. One of which is that civil society organizations need to have more funding support. The essence for this is that it would allow independent checkmating, and allow civil society actors to actually hold public office holders to account. Another recommendation that have come out of this report is that there is need for more collaboration among civil society actors in the state to open the civic space in Rivers State. And a very salient point that I need to note at this point is that there is the need for civil society actors to be better organized and, keyword, to remain credible, just to ensure that the fight for the protection and expansion of civic space in Rivers State is attained. There are also a couple of other recommendations that have come as a result of our research, which would be made available by the end of this webinar. But just to keep to my 5 minutes talk, I would like to pass on the baton back to Alex. So Alex, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flora. And that was spot on within 5 minutes. So I didn't have to come in and warn you to speed up, which I will be doing to the other speakers. If we're running out of time, I'll come in and remind you. But that was perfect, right in 5 minutes. So it is interesting to hear about the research findings and some of the threats that CSOs are facing. And I'm looking forward to hearing how the others will see the situation. So let's move on to our next speaker. I'd like to go to Mr. George Will. Please, sir, the floor is open to you for your 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me clearly?
Very clearly, sir.
Okay. Sorry, you may be hearing some small noise here and there because I'm actually on transit. Unfortunately, it has to be so something happened. But that notwithstanding, I think I'm in a place that you hear me very clearly. The civic space, especially in the Rivers State, where our civil society coalition have done a lot of work, especially in conjunction with organizations like SDN, and like she said, the project she was talking about, we are the heart and the center of it in conjunction with other persons who were involved in that action. And very clearly, state and non-state actors have been very, very active in shrinking the civic space, especially on a clear example from the state actors, just like she mentioned, that the Rivers State governor had to call off, as in ban the protest, as in saying that they would, as in a civilian regime, a democratically elected governor, a governor who himself is a lawyer, a governor who is a member of the body of benchers, say that he has banned protests in a constitutional democracy. Terrible. But like Flora said, our civil society coalition, the River State Civil Society organizations, I was able to make straight, clear statement and ask Rivers people to come out in their numbers. And like she said, we were able to not just come out, we marched to Government House and equally forced the governor to even come to address us. It was and that was one of the key achievements that we have been able to gain within that period and are equally built on it. But beyond that, it has equally continued. The youth group declared a protest because a company called Julius Berger was doing construction, and they demanded to know the bill of lading and the processes around it, even local content in terms of employment and what have you. The Rivers State governor declared them wanted. It was that bad, and was saying that if they dare come to that place, he's charging the police and the local government chairman to go after them. It was that bad. Civil society was not really involved in that process, but in the sidelines we condemned it. Even though we were unable to get the youth groups to get into the process. Another case in point was a group led by one Toba, the leader of the conscience of Ogoni, who was on a radio show. The chief of staff to the River State governor bounced into the radio show and practically forced the show to a closure, to an end. And the guest speaker, who is the leader of the conscience of Ogoni people, had to be forced out of the studio. It was that bad. And he took over at the podium and was practically talking to Nigerians and of course Rivers people. This is just one of such cases, such draconian excesses of our state government in terms of gagging the space. But we even see a situation where even officers in this government are unable to even freely express themselves. As you may be aware, the Commissioner for Environment, was part of an event. Of course, SDN was part of the organization of that event, and it was also to talk about suits. While the commissioner was part of that event, even praising government and even making claims that government had not even done about suits, because the commissioner for environment had the effrontery to be part of that event, the commissioner was sacked. Though later government came to say that he was sacked because he was asking questions about Julius Berger. But of course, those of us who have been following the trends in Rivers State, how the civil space has been gagged in Rivers State, knows that that was just an afterthought. When civil society condemned, of course, for personally, I was on the African Independent Television (AIT). A national television condemned the action, call out government, and of course government had to start backtracking and looking for excuses that it was not because he was part of a suit event, but was because he called a company to question or something like that. So that's the difference of government. But we know that is not actually true. And for non-state actors, we have seen situations where people freely assemble for whatever reason, rightly or wrongly, especially members of the opposition party. We have seen talks sponsored to clamp down on these persons. In fact, the atmosphere is so tense that most members of the opposition party cannot even freely gather without fear or favor in most parts of the local government area, especially in the hinterlands. You know,
yes.
so these
Mr.
are
Jojo,
yeah.
Mr. Jojo, yeah. Sorry to cut. Your time is running out, so maybe.
Okay. Lastly, Lastly, I think that these are the threats that we are facing in the state, and although we are battling it, though we are fighting it. But again, this is a situation, and of course, there is need for civil society and other actors to mobilize to set up a resistance to this. Though we are doing it, but I think that it needs to be amplified. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jojo, for rounding up there. And very interesting to hear about the state issues. You add some more detail to some of the issues that are going on, despite having a governor who's a very vocal lawyer. It'd be interesting to hear how some of these points that you forced them to respond on have led to changes. Perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion. But for now, let's move on to Inibehe Efyong. So your 5 minutes start now.
Thank you for the invitation to speak at this webinar. All I can say is that the crisis and the continuous shrinking of the civic space in Rivers State, it is only a symptom of a larger malaise within the larger of the Nigerian society. The issue really, Rivers State somehow is unfortunately in a position where it is being ruled by an emperor. And these are things we have to say very clearly. Wike has no pretense. He doesn't pretend to be a Democrat. He doesn't give anybody the impression or the principles of democracy. And that's why he had been very virulent, very aggressive in his continuous and sustained attack on the civic space, whether by threatening leaders of labor unions, including his own professional association. Judiciary workers went on strike. You would have read the scandalous threats issued by Wike against the members and leaders of the Judiciary Staff Union of Workers of Nigeria, giving them an ultimatum to either resume or be sacked. I have just read this morning that he has also issued a similar threat to members of the Nigerian Medical Association. In fact, he has issued similar threats to other persons. You will also recall during the COVID, when Wike went about demolishing somebody's or private property, hotels, and so on a flimsy reason that COVID-19 safety protocols were flouted. So what we are seeing, the evidence that has been cited, the instances that have been given, these are just reflections of a general malaise, a governor who is terribly afflicted by this sense of dictatorship, by this sense of absolutism that is either me or nobody else. And he doesn't pretend about this. He has also extended these dictatorial tendencies to even the judiciary and the House of Assembly in the state. So for me, it's a very long walk to freedom for the civic space, the civil society, and the human rights community in Rivers State. The challenge, however, which again is not peculiar to Rivers State, is that apart from the few consensus vociferous voices within the civic space and the civil society, a large percentage of the Nigerian population seems to have resigned to fate. At the end of the day, you see, there is a limit to what we can do as members of the civil society. If the larger population continues to spread this unnecessary tolerance for tyranny, for undemocratic tendencies, we hardly see people react. Thankfully, we saw that during the NSAS, but that looks more or less like an isolated incident. You explain where citizens to endure the excesses of these demigods who call themselves governors in Nigeria. Wike is just one of them. There is no governor in Nigeria today that is accountable. There is no governor in Nigeria today that can be brought within the framework of the rule of law. They believe they are above the law. They believe they are not accountable to anybody. They have subverted the parliament. They have subverted the judiciary. They have rubbished the local government system. All these things reflect on the civic space, because when you say you want to protest, when you say you want to exercise your constitutional rights, and you have a man who sees himself as the most important person in the state, a man who believes he's above every other person, then you have a serious crisis in your, which is why I must also commend the very active and vibrant Rivers State Civil Society Organization on a lot.
That's good. Last 30 seconds, sir.
Also encourage them to continue to forge ahead in their drive in favor of Rivers State accountable. I think that is what the remarks I can make at this point. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Inibehe. Very key insight from you and your experience with the judiciary in your legal practice. You outlined some points on citizen apathy under our emperors and demigods. Those are your words, not mine. But I also liked how you talked about the judiciary and the labor unions, of course, which were once so powerful within the civic space, but have just declined over the years as a consequence of civic space shrinking. So we'll move on to our final speaker now. That's Chioma Ezenwafo. Chioma, the floor is over to you for the next 5 minutes.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Alex. I like that you pronounce my name so well. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I like that we're having this conversation about the civic space. Most especially, I want to talk about it as the way it affects me as a journalist, as a media person. And also because I've covered the civic space for some years, considering the nature of my organization, Nigeria Info. Can we all hear me?
Yes, Chioma, very well. Please continue.
All right, so Nigeria Info is a talk station. It means that we talk development, we talk changes in society, and it means that my job is to track these changes and developments. And one of the first things I observed in coming to work in Rivers State especially is the lack of freedom of expression. You know, as a journalist, you go to the street, you try to get people to talk about issues that are glaring, they're actually very obvious, and they are really skeptical about, sharing their experiences and sharing, and you need the information on the experiences they are sharing to be able to do your story, to have richer conversations on air, but people are not willing. And when I sought to really understand why people weren't willing to share what was obvious, and let's say the issues of insecurity, for instance, people are really worried about security and they're not feeling safe. Why aren't you talking about it? Why are you unwilling to talk about your experiences and how you feel unsafe? Probing more led me to understand the concept of shrinking civic spaces. And thanks to SDN, they've actually given it a name now, which is shrinking civic spaces. I didn't actually encompass it that way until I started interacting with SDN. And now I completely can call it what it is, shrinking civic spaces. We've seen it affect the way we do our job as reporters and as producers of programs on radio. Most especially, I also see it beyond River State is a Nigerian thing as well, because we see it in the way laws are made for us, and the different adjustments. Of course, we had when Twitter, for instance, in Nigeria, we can no longer tweet. I don't know any other instance of the impact of the shrinking of the civic space that can be seen and clearly demonstrated in the way Twitter was shut down in Nigeria. That's clearly the evidence of, or gives you an idea rather, what the media is grappling with here in Nigeria or in River State, because you have to, even when you have your facts, you have to be very intentional in the way you write about it and the way you share it on air, because of the way it will be perceived. Because most times we really are writing and telling the stories because we want change. And so we are usually very deliberate about the words we use and how we report it, because we really would not want to be seen as we wouldn't want a situation where it doesn't turn out that way. Let me put it that way. We wouldn't want a situation where, oh, you're writing about a particular situation going on, and then because the government perceives it a certain way, nothing is done about it. So yeah, the shrinking civic space has affected the way the media functions, and we see it also for it affects the denial of access to information. Is also what we've seen, because the media that works with civil society gets really informed and gets to know exactly what government agency to approach. And so when you approach them, you can hear questions like, how did we know? How did you know this was happening? And I think this is also a place to commend the civil society. The civil society in River State have done so good work. And yeah, to an extent has helped the media to better report on these things. Okay, so, but it also revealed the fact that the government isn't willing to share information, because even when the civil society have helped the media to see where to go and what questions to ask, we do not see enough of those information shared with us here at the media. We've also seen it, we see them constantly reminding you of the media laws and media ethics, even when your job is done in such a professional way that it doesn't affect any of that. But somehow, when you are constantly reminded, it's easy for a journalist to, take a few steps backwards and just be careful in the way they report. So yeah, the shrinking civic space affects media practice in River State. And of course, we've also seen all kinds of subtle threats and censorships, and where certain media houses are not let into certain media briefings, just because they do not want you to expand the conversation. They want the conversation to stay just within the ambit of what they want, what they are dishing out. Okay, so it's a reality for us here, and so I'm going
Sorry
to
to cut you,
that.
Choma. Just
Yes.
coming to the end of your time. So if you could conclude, please.
Yes, I was going to conclude to say that we need to train more journalists on reporting the civic space with the changing landscape, and so that we can, work with civil society better to, continue to help people to express. Because if we're talking about human rights, you have right to information, right to freedom, right to expression, and we cannot. And we also have the duty to hold government accountable. To be able to do our jobs better, we need a level of training to continue to report the civic space. And of course, we also need the civil society to, understand how the media works and what constraints they have, so that it can improve the relationship they both have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Choma. That was really fascinating to get the journalist's perspective on this civic space issue, and think about some of those consequences that are very real on our freedom of expression. People are free and talk freely and very vocal normally, but not publicly, and that's really damaging, because we rely on that to inform ourselves and find solutions to things. So thank you. And wow, what a fantastic panel presentations we've had so far. Really blessed with that. Now, before we move on to questions from the public, we have some questions here listed down for ourselves. But before we moved on, I would like to open the floor for the panelists that are here with us. Would anybody like to respond to what somebody else has said, or maybe some points came to mind after you had finished your own presentation? Please, if anyone would like to talk, just unmute yourself.
Yes, Alex, thanks, Alex. I would like to hinge on the point that Chioma raised. I think in Rivers State, from the research that we've conducted, a lot of journalists are actually facing, some of these violations by political actors. So it's either they don't have a voice, or the government is, pressing strongly against their paper or their station. And in that light, they tend to have to soft pedal on some of their advocacy issues on or within civic space issues. I think the journalists are the most abused in Rivers State on issues relating to civic space, always wanting to shut out dissenting voices, always wanting to quell some of their questions about accountability and all of that bit. So I tend to get support from journalists like listed by Chioma. Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay, Mr. George, well, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think just a quick one. I think Comrade the Comrade lawyer, add a lot of flavor and addition to the conversation. So much so that it's as if he is even living in Rivers State. It's terrible. The kind of attacks on labor centers, organizations, unions, like Nebe said, even NMA. Recently, resident doctors were on strike. The governor threatened that he's going to, as a no work, no pay. People observing industrial strike just recently. In fact, when, of course, they mentioned the issue of judicial workers, but they were not alone. Even parliamentary staff in the states that have been owed several entitlements that have not been paid. There have been several entitlements that have not been paid. Their salaries were slashed. As in, even after they had even called off the strike, they were paid half salaries, as threatened by the government, even though their demands have not been met, no negotiation, nothing, they were not called to the round table. This is terrible. Another thing the government does in trying to change its civic space is to create pseudo civil society organizations, reactionary organizations, to counter positions of three civil society organizations that reflects the opinions or the realities of the day or the opinions of the ordinary people. So you now see very funny characters, some of them even former civil society actors. So their job, or some even totally new breeds, in the new, they just bring them, give them some resources, get to friendly media stations, so, and their job is to counter whatever you do. In fact, in some cases, they even impersonate your organizations, to say that the person talking does not represent the organization, that the person is an impostor, and all those kind of characters, So these are another way they have used to gag the space. I think that will be all for now as we go forward.
Very interesting additional points, sir. Mr. Inebehe, any additional thoughts from you? Or should we proceed?
Just to say that for me, let us not believe that the attacks this reckless abuse of power is going to end. Unfortunately, we just have to endure and continue to resist to 2023 because the wicked that I know is not repentant. And for me, I feel sometimes we need to be personal about these things because the people who are shrinking the civic space, they are human beings. They have faces, they have names. So when we address the consequence of their actions, we must also address them in person so that they will not feel that we do not know what we are talking about. River State is, as I said, is just a representation of what has become the sense of superiority of governors. Governors are even more totalitarian than the president. At the level of the National Assembly, at the national level, one can still see some pretense of opposition. But across the states, especially states like Rivers, you don't even see any semblance of opposition at the formal level outside the civil society. The House of Assembly has been totally decimated. Nobody asked questions. In Rivers, for example, the governor the other time came out and was announcing to the whole world on national TV that he had donated vehicles to judges, he had built quarters to judges. This is an abuse of the democratic process. That you have the head of one organ of government going on public record to talk as if he's doing a favor to judges and all that. What that entails is that these key actors, these key institutions have been compromised, which is why we must commend and also encourage the Rivers State Civil Society Organization, the media in Rivers State, and of course other consensual voices. There was a time during the COVID thing when Wike went wild and was destroying people's property. I spoke with Nigeria Info in Port Harcourt. The interview elicited a lot of reaction. And I was getting calls from Rivers State, some of them threatening calls. And I could imagine what those who are on ground are going through. So that tells you the severity of the situation, which is why conversations like this, will have to continue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, sir. Okay, so we've all had a chance to respond to each other's presentations now. I think we can move on to some questions. Now I'll just pose these questions to everybody and go around everybody to get an answer, but feel free to jump in first or second as you please. So our first question relates to the results of this survey. Now this survey and study, it came to the overall conclusion that the rating of civic space is oppressed, but that is better than the rating given at a national level, so for the whole of Nigeria, in another study. So the question is the civic space really more free and more open in Rivers State than in the rest of Nigeria? And what are the differences between the civic space situation in Rivers State when we compare it to elsewhere in Nigeria? Who would like to answer that question for us first?
Okay, let me go first.
Okay, thank you, John.
I would not agree that it's more open. That's what you said, right?
Yes. That Rivers State is more open than nationwide.
It actually sounds like what politicians would say. But when you ask the key elements that make up the civic space, which is media, civil society, you would see that Rivers State, I traveled there recently, and most of the organizations, the NGOs I worked with there, where I was, they kept talking about, whenever we mention Rivers, they'll be like, that Rivers State, when you go there, you will now. So from what I was perceiving, they are usually very careful the moment the work they are able to do in other parts of the country. Once they have to go to Rivers State to carry out the same project, they change tactics, they change body language, they are very careful. They don't do it the normal way. Shouldn't that be the clear that for me, that's like a clear indicator that Rivers State is quite peculiar. And it's clearly also seen in the terrain and the nature. When you look at the politics, when you look at the economics, what the economy of the state is about, which is oil, for instance, and how it's also the reason and the center of most of the conflict we suffer here, then you see why it's totally incorrect to say that the civic space here is more open. That's what you said, right?
Yeah, that's what the results show.
Okay, that result is really, for me as a journalist, I've practiced in River State as a journalist more than any other city in Nigeria, and what I can really say it's otherwise. Really, it is.
Yeah, interesting to hear that. I'm facilitating this, so I'm neutral, but at the same time, I agree with what you said. Anybody else like to speak to that question?
Yes, I'll actually like to jump in on what Chioma said. Now, like she mentioned, River State is very, very peculiar. For River State, there are other factors that influence, things relating to River State. So factors such as the oil and gas revenue, that is available to the political elites. How it plays, the power play. So in a way, it eliminates any kind of dissenting voice from civil society organizations. So River State is a hotspot for gang violence, it's a hotspot for kidnapping, arms dealing, electoral fraud, and other variants of insecurity. So for River State, you really have to be careful when you talk about civic space issues and how to deal with it. We all are aware of what happened, the outpour from the press conference that was held by the Commissioner of Environment. We all know how it played out concerning the suit. So for River State, you have to do like a double take and then think about other alternatives that you can plug to ensure that some of your agitations are met. So for River State, you really have to be careful as compared to other states in the country.
Yeah, thanks, Flora. I think those are really important points. That revenue raises the stakes for people to fight to maintain power and get rid of any dissenting voices, and is supercharged by the prevalence of violence and arms and other issues that are being faced in River State. Very, very key points. Over to the two gentlemen. Would either of you like to come in on that question? Differences between rivers and nationwide.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Giorgio, is that you? Please.
Okay. Just like Neighbor said, it is actually generic. This problem is actually generic in nature. However, we must tell ourselves, of course, we saw what happened to at the hour Yahya Bello treated the Buhari must go protesters in Kogi. So I think it's the general character of the Nigerian governors. However, we must, okay, for Governor Wike, with due respect, why people seem to give him some leave is because he has not openly, arrested anyone and jailed the person. Otherwise, is as in the traits he has exhibited, the disposition he has displayed, and some of the actions he has taken, especially against labor centers, civil society, and some other persons, one can readily say that he is among the top. As in this government, the government of River State, or the space in River State, is among those that are trained the most. The only thing is that the only difference, and that is what we just give aim or this government some pass mark, is because they are not like the Agba Jalingo's situation in the Cross River. He has not arrested anyone and jailed anyone. Or like in the Buhari must go protesters in the Kogi State. That is the only good thing. That have been associated in terms of civic space shrinking. That is the only good thing you can mention. Otherwise, in barely any other thing, that is associated with civic space or drinking with the civic space, I think he has scored worst. You know, I think that must be noted. And in terms of national average, I want to say that even the federal government has even fared better. Because some of the things, why I not only brief for the federal government, I am not a fan of the federal government or I'm a fan of the president. I've condemned him openly, and of course, I've done so because I belong to very critical organizations that have called him out. But truth be told, some of the things that he has even tolerated, most of these governors, especially the River State government, wouldn't have tolerated it. I think that would be my position on this matter.
Okay, Mr. George, well, I think you also had something to say. Okay.
George, you just spoke.
Okay, I got it mixed up. Sorry about that. Yeah,
okay, so if I could just I can just intervene. What? I'm being muted. So there is this climate of fear in River State, which goes even to the leadership recruitment process. We are all witnesses. We are aware of how volatile elections in River State have been over the years. There is always this climate of anarchy. People are killed, a lot of gun violence, a lot of things, malpractice. So this extends, in fact, it is believed that if you don't have a tendency for violence, you cannot become a governor in River State. But that is a wrong perception. But again, this perception cannot just be dismissed by a wave of the hand. If you are, for those who have observed the electoral process in River State, so that is also reflected in the larger Niger Delta context, because there is this thing about violence and elections within the Niger Delta, with River State as the epicenter. Now, that also, again, can be traced partly to the militancy in the region. Many people are yet to come out of that culture of insurgency, that culture of militancy, where guns are used as the means of agitation. So when you have a civil society trying to use non-violence to communicate, some people are unable to appreciate it. So that explains partly the volatile nature of River State, apart from the fact that, as I said, you have an emperor as the governor. The other factor is money. You cannot take out the role of money in all this. There is a lot of money in River State in relative terms. In comparison to other states, River State is one of the richest states in the country because of oil revenue. So the governor has a lot of money to throw around. People in politics, there's a lot of resources. And because there is no accountability, that also creates a sense and a culture of impunity. So when you have a civil society trying to hold power accountable, trying to speak truth to power, the natural response from those in power is to fight back, is to attack. And that explains why these things are going on. So these are the peculiarities, but I must advise and also note that these things are not peculiar to River State. They may be more pronounced because of the character of the man at the helm of affairs. But like my colleague rightly said, if you look at Kogi State, you also have this erratic man there as the governor. Somebody who goes publicly to threaten people, somebody who goes publicly to make provocative statements. You also have another one in Kogi State. There are a couple of other states where you have this almighty set of emperors in Nigeria. But don't forget the point I made when I started, that no governor in Nigeria today is accountable. Not even one. Not even one governor. There is no governor in Nigeria today that we can say clearly has strictly complied or has been very friendly with the civil society. Maybe with minor exceptions like the man in Oyo State, who identified with the NSAS protesters, who have been more receptive to civic engagement. Apart from those, very few examples. Look at Kaduna State. That is another example of a tyrant in power. So from Kaduna to Kogi to Rivers, you have this assemblage of emperors that are determined to destroy the country. And that explains why they continue to shrink the civic space, because the civic space today is the only voice of opposition in the country. At the partisan level, there is no opposition, whether it is APC or PDP. As a matter of fact, Rivers State is under a PDP government, a party that is supposed to be in opposition to the party at the center. But look at the conversation that we are having. And that is the final point I want to make. Look at the conversation that we are having. We are talking about Rivers State, a state that is under the PDP. And we are complaining about tyranny by Buhari at the federal level. And you now have a so-called opposition state also replicating, even in more monstrous manner, the same tendencies, anti-democratic tendencies that we are having at the federal level. So that shows you the lack of ideology, that shows you the lack of principle in political party in this country. That's why we are talking about Rivers State, because if truly Rivers State is an opposition state, then they should be different from the center. But again, as I have said, this is the dilemma of the Nigerian people. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I just want to say I'm sorry for muting you at the start. I didn't do it intentionally. Before you accuse me of being one of the emperors that are silencing the judiciary. Let me just be clear. Yeah. Okay. So we're almost at the end of our time here. I feel like we could discuss the pressures that we are facing within the civic space for hours and hours. But interestingly, it's only started to form a real dialogue over the last year or so. I think the issues like the NSAS protests really made people realize that civic space is a thing, is worth fighting for, and it's important for people in Nigeria to be able to participate in that. So maybe we should have more discussions in future on the issues. But for now, I think it would be nice to round up with a question on the way forwards, and we'll just ask each of the panelists to kind of give their final remarks on this subject. So the question is, with all these pressures that we're facing in civic space, how manage? What are the survival tactics that we are using within the civic space to still do our work, and how can we come together to have more of an impact? What are your experiences from practice and your recommendations for others who may be listening and thinking, how do we overcome this? So just a minute or two to answer that question. May I start with you, Flora?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. From all indications, I think what we should work towards is for civil society actors to actually come together. I think it's better when we are a united front and try to open up the civic space in Rivers State as opposed to working in silos. So for me, going forward, I think that it is necessary for civil society actors, different organizations to come together, and then we look at the key issues and advocate on it as one voice to the necessary authority. I think that way we can begin to open up civic space in Rivers State. Thank you.
Thank you, Flora. Now can we go to you, Mr. Effiong, since your microphone is unmuted.
Thank you. So just to conclude by saying that conversations like this has to continue, not just virtually. I am hoping that the subsequent ones will have an opportunity to talk about these things physically in Rivers State, where people can also come and we can also have this conversation beyond, a virtual conversation. But it is important that we have started this. I can only say that this clearly shows that there's a lot of work to be done, which is why we need to galvanize, forces within and outside Rivers State and make strategic interventions when the need arises. I'm also encouraging our people, our comrades in Rivers State, to reach out. Some of us are always available. Areas that we can, give strategic support to, support whatever interventions or actions you are carrying out. Please let us know. We'll be very willing to assist.
Okay, thank you, sir. Over to Chioma for your final thoughts, please.
Okay, yes, I really appreciate the contribution so far. It's also helping me understand, shape my own perspective better. I like that we all shared freely, and I find this conversation has also created space for all of us. And I really find a gap in the way the civic space is reported. I feel like if we have more journalists understanding what's going on in the way we've come to learn here, that is going to help them be more deliberate on the way they report it. Okay, so I'm going to say that I look forward to organizations like SDN and even more organizations working with SDN to train more journalists to report the civic space with the current reality we find, especially in Rivers State. Okay, so that we do not just have a conversation and it goes away. I've tried to assess the reports as well. I'm going to study it, and with that training, the journalists can pick up from there and do more reports and more stories can be told. Of course, they said that journalists are historians in a hurry. So when we write and archive some of these stories, we do it more deliberately and more intentionally. Thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. And last but not least, let's go to our chairman, Mr. George Will. So, your final remarks.
I think that very instructive, which is training of more journalists on these issues, so they are braced with it and equally see that as have a sense of duty towards it. Because truth be told, some are actually hostile, and not necessarily because they don't want it, but more like not understanding these issues and in a better way to equip themselves to face the challenges. I think too that the area of support for organizations that are working on these civil spaces, when I mean support, it must not necessarily be money. It could be legal framework. Of course, our comrade neighbor has always shown a hand of fellowship, but I mean a more structural legal framework, because sometimes some activists, for the fear that nobody is standing up for them, if they engage in the process, those kind of issues can make them chicken out. Then again, legal activism around the civic space, isolated cases, we pick them and challenge these in court. To pick isolated cases, challenges in court, especially on issues around accountability. Civic space issues around accountability. Pick them up, dust the papers, and make sure that we challenge this to the end. Both on pro bono basis and on areas of little support, and of course the training of collaborations of media and civil society on these issues are very, very important. These are public interest issues. So we think too that through trainings by both activists and journalists, the issues of collaboration will be clearer and ideas will be sharpened. Then the last but not the least, the question of getting your facts correct. One of the things that have saved the Rivers State Civil Society organizations, and that is what we have used to make government to be scared in attacking us, is that we have always make sure that we are on the path of truth and on the path of facts. Government, as bad as they are, sometimes when issues are clear enough and loud enough, they kind of backtrack. Sometimes even when it is clear enough, they still strike or they still attack. But somehow it has a way of putting them on their toes when the facts are very, very clear. So I think too that as civil society actors, as our non-governmental organizations, should do well to make sure that the facts are sacred. And so that when we push them, we are very confident and we get better results.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Thank you to all of our panelists today, Flora, Chioma, Inebehe, and Enefa. We've been really privileged to have you all on one panel together and listen to your experiences and your thoughts on some of the consequences of shrinking civic space. We've also covered some of the realities of Rivers State and its position within the country, and how its ranking is probably on par with some of the worst places in the country. You know, this, as we've shown, this discussion is very rich and one that we should definitely continue into the future. But you know, let it not just be dialogue. I like that we're also action focused, and I think our track record for all of us here demonstrates that we're willing to step forwards and do what it takes to protect and expand the civic space. So thank you all once again for joining this webinar with SDN. We've reached the end of our time here. I would like to direct you to our website where the report will be published in full, and an executive summary too. Do take a look. A lot of the issues are discussed in more detail, and I'm sure that will prompt a lot more thoughts there. And if you do have any questions, please get in touch with us at info@stakeholderdemocracy.org. That's all one word, stakeholderdemocracy.org. So on this note, bring the webinar to a close. Thank you all once again, and to our participants for listening in. Do have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Alex.